I can't remember when I first realized that I was seen as a gendered human being. Maybe it was in the elementary school playground, when boys talked about girls having cooties and I realized that I was included in the cooties group. Maybe it was when I transferred to a private middle school that had a uniform, which involved wearing either a skirt or pants, and I would rather wear dirty pants than a skirt. Maybe it was when the other girls at camp began shaving their legs at age 11, and I was confused why it was necessary. Regardless of when this recognition occurred, I knew that I never felt comfortable in my assigned gender. I didn't identify with traditionally feminine things, and I hated my body for its girly shape. This made me feel incredibly uncomfortable and pushed me to wearing clothing that hid my body, claiming to simply be a tomboy or not interested in girly things. It was only when I came to college that I realized that my gender identity was one that didn't fit within a binary. I was, in fact, non-binary. And that got me thinking. What impact had my education had on my understanding of gender? How had the gendered expectations of my schools impacted the way I viewed my personal gender identity and the gender of those around me? I'm Sarah Abramson, and on this week's episode of Let's Talk About That, I'm looking at gender and education. Before we jump down the rabbit hole, let's get some definitions set first so we're all working with the same information. All of these definitions are based on the organization Gender Spectrums, a link to which can be found in the description of this podcast, along with all the other sources used in this episode. First, there's sex. Sex is a term that refers to a person's external and internal genitalia that is used to label them as male or female and is often assumed to be the same as their gender identity. Sex seems cut and dry, but there are actually a whole host of conditions that can make a person intersex. So even sex is not a binary. Then there is gender identity. This is a person's internal sense of self in regards to gender. This can be masculine, feminine, both, or neither, and it can correspond with a person's sex, but it doesn't have to. Separate from gender identity are gender expression and gender roles. Gender expression is how a person expresses their gender using clothing, language, names, and other cultural markers. It can be informed by gender roles, which are ideas about gender created and enforced by society. When someone identifies with their gender assigned at birth, that means they are cisgender. When someone identifies differently than their assigned gender at birth, that means they are transgender. So someone who was assigned male at birth but identifies as female is a trans woman. There are also people who don't have a strong leaning toward a masculine or feminine gender identity, and they fall under the term non-binary. All of these people use gender expression differently and are impacted by gender roles in different ways. I'll link to more resources in the description box below if you want to learn more about gender identity and all of the different parts of gender and sex. Now let's jump into how gender and education interact. Gender and education are incredibly intertwined. The first formal schools in the US only admitted male students. So American education literally begins with the upholding of gender roles and sexism. And while things have gotten better, there are still elements of education that are deeply rooted in gender roles. One of the most obvious examples is uniforms and dress codes. They became increasingly popular after the 1990s, when President Bill Clinton not only mentioned uniforms in his State of the Union address, but had the Department of Education create guidelines for school districts to enable them to adopt uniforms for all students. Uniforms obviously vary from school to school, and the research is unclear as to whether or not they help or hinder student performance. In researching this topic, sources yo-yoed between claiming that uniforms did amazing good for students and claiming they were the worst for students. But when you actually talk to students, you can immediately see the negative impact that uniforms and dress codes can have. For girls, uniforms and dress codes have become about making sure that their bodies are covered so that they aren't a distraction to boys and their male teachers. Putting aside the problematic idea that a male teacher would be distracted by a female student's clothing and that it is her job to make sure he isn't, these rules teach girls from a young age that their bodies are the problem. If a boy is staring at a girl's breasts, dress codes and policies accompanying them tell students that it is the girl's fault and correct the clothing, not the behavior. For boys, dress codes and uniforms enforce societal ideas about masculinity and punish them for deviating from the norm. A 2006 study by DaCosta asked students for their opinion on their school's uniform policy. And students talked about not only how they greatly disliked the uniform policy, but it was enforced unevenly. For example, one student remarked that having a clean-cut hairstyle could enable him to get away with breaking the rules. Additionally, all of the court rulings that help to bolster dress codes and uniform policies are vague and can lead to things slipping through the cracks because students become super sleuths when it comes to finding loopholes. Here's a personal example. I remember that in high school, at one point, our dress code banned clothing that showed the curvature of the breast. That is the exact language they used to tell female students they couldn't wear tight tops. As someone who was already uncomfortable in their feminine body, I remember feeling incredibly embarrassed by the fact that any tighter shirt I owned, of which there weren't many, could be breaking the dress code because of the body I hated. Uniforms represent one of the ways that schools enforce gender roles and prevent students from exploring their gender identity. Then, there is sex ed. Almost everyone has a sex ed story. Sex ed is taught to some degree across the US, but the curriculum is by no means standardized. Some students get education like my high school. They are fairly inclusive, with everyone learning about male and female anatomy, and there were discussions of LGBT issues, although there were definitely things missing about gender, and there was no mention of things like being non-binary. Other students get abstinence-only education, which teaches them that they have to avoid sex at all cost outside of a monogamous marriage, or they will either get an STI or get pregnant. To quote Mean Girls, "Don't have sex, 'cause you will get pregnant and die." There are even states with no promo homo laws, which forbid teachers from even discussing any queer issues, and some even require teachers to portray homosexuality in a negative light. You may be wondering why I am talking about sex ed. After all, I defined sex as being separate from gender identity. But sex education is incredibly gendered and has the potential to do serious harm. Many abstinence-only sex ed programs are highly gendered, pushing a message of female weakness and male strength that is rooted in stereotypes and heteronormativity. Sex ed is also where many students are or are not taught about consent and what it means to have a healthy relationship. In a 2018 article, Grace Tater pointed out that without having an understanding of consent and what it means to be in a healthy relationship, students are unable to safely navigate sex, as they don't know how to engage in those kinds of conversation. When you take this fact and combine it with the fact that 1 in 5 women will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime, and 91% of rape victims are women, it becomes incredibly clear how sex ed in the United States fails to teach girls that they have a right to bodily autonomy and fails to teach boys to respect that autonomy. You cannot teach sex education without an understanding of gender identity, gender roles, and gender bias. These are a few of the major ways that gender and education intersect. But there are also little things. Things like having kids line up by sex or what books are available in the classroom. Things like boys being seen as rowdy and girls being seen as quiet, maybe bossy if they happen to speak their mind. Gender influences every aspect of society, but education is a key area of research because in order to change how we act as a society, we have to start with what the dollhouse to monster truck ratio is in a preschool classroom. After doing all this research and writing, I wanted to talk to some real people about what their experience in school was like and how it impacted their understanding of gender. So I sat down with my friends and asked them a few questions about gender and education.
My name is Catherine Ann Pack, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Hi, I'm Shwetha. My pronouns are she and they.
My name is Lance Silberstein, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
My name is Dana, and I use they, them.
I'm Marielle, and I use she, her, hers pronouns.
My name is Vidula, and my pronouns are she, hers, or they, them.
Do you remember when you first realized that society had expectations for you based on your sex?
I was enamored with the idea of a Disney princess as somebody who was constantly kind and delicate. I was also enamored with the idea of dresses. I tried to model my behavior on Disney princesses to a large extent. I frequently told people, and still somehow believe, that you know how some people say if you're going to have a role model, you might as well make it be God, because it's always better to aspire to the best? I said that about Snow White.
Forever. Wait. I don't think there was a specific time I grew up with a twin brother.
I remember sort of always looking for idols in the past rather than in the present, if that makes sense. And I was never looking to be a girl that was modern day kind of thing. It was either I was a historical girl, and that's why I would wear frumpy dresses and bonnets to school. So I don't really remember ever someone telling me this is your expectation based on your gender when I was little. It was just always sort of coming from reading these books, and I read a lot of books that I would sort of think about what gender expectations were in the past, and that sort of gave me more of a sense of what they would be in the present.
I'm going to be honest, I do not remember, but I remember just it mostly I don't remember the first time, but I remember in high school there was always this sense of all the guys in my class, particularly in my math classes and my science classes, they would act like they knew everything, and they'd be they were really posturing. They were definitely trying to show off, and it made me feel because they knew everything already, that meant that I didn't, and therefore that I was inherently bad at math and science.
I mean, I think I noticed this more applied to my mother before I really experienced any kind of expectations. It was always noticeable my mother was the one who was in charge of all the family get-togethers and doing all the work around the house, all the cooking and cleaning. And eventually, when I was old enough, I was told, like, I was expected to do the same thing, though, like, my father never seemed to have this pressure on him to do that, or my brothers. But they were older than me, so they did more chores than me when I was younger. So I think I noticed it more with, like, the dynamic between my parents than between me and my siblings until later.
So in terms of expectations from society, it was more so being educated on the fact that I didn't have to live up to them by my own mom, since she is a professor and she's pretty well versed on gender theory. For her, what was important was that I didn't feel like because I was a girl I couldn't do certain things, and so I was always thrust into science camp and like doing whatever I wanted to do. And when I wanted to play piano, she put me into piano class, and it was just I did what I wanted to do and it didn't matter. But the biggest, I guess, trigger for me in terms of realizing that I'm really a girl, because I didn't truly feel too different. The first one was in kindergarten when this guy started chasing me around and he like twisted my arm around my body, and while I was in the jungle gym, and I went and complained to the teacher. I was like, this guy like hurt me. I don't know what this problem was. And she goes, ha ha ha, he just likes you.
How did you feel about your gender identity growing up?
I felt like my gender defined my identity to a moderate to large extent. I think this was more on a, well, actually it was both on a subconscious and a conscious level. I was really proud of my identity. I was happy to be a girl, and I was sometimes like really uncomfortable when I thought maybe I would have been born a boy, just because sometimes that happens and there's a lottery. And what if I'd been born a boy? I would be a completely different person, and I wouldn't like myself as much. And I felt and I felt sort of uncomfortable with the idea of me as a boy. And then I said, but I'm not born a boy, I'm born a girl, because girls are better than boys. And then I debated the issue among my fellow second to fifth graders, as people do.
Oh, I hated it. I did not like wearing dresses and actively rebelled. I hated the color pink and actively rebelled. I liked climbing things, and my parents didn't like me climbing things. I think I tried to emulate my brother a lot, unconsciously, because I wanted to not be a girl. It didn't really work out that well, to be perfectly honest. My brother is not a paragon of masculinity. I remember once, this was like, I don't remember, I think it was in maybe 5th grade. I bought a dress on my own. It was pink, you know? Because in that moment, I was like, you know what? God damn it, I'm gonna buy a pink dress. I never wore the dress. My mom got so mad at me. She's like, why did you even buy it if you're not gonna wear it?
Confusing. So I think for me, growing up as non-binary and also as someone on the spectrum was sort of confusing, because I think for a lot of people, they just sort of absorb via observations in society. They just sort of absorb like how they're supposed to act and how they're supposed to dress, and I never really did that. So I think I'm trying to think about how to say this eloquently, but that's not coming to me right now. Doesn't have to. Yeah. So I think that like I never really sort of understood what a girl was supposed to be, at least in the present, or like outside of a fantasy book that I would read. So I think that like when other girls were like interested in makeup, and I thought I was a girl at the time, that's why I mean other girls. But other girls were interested in makeup or in sort of like other sort of traditionally girly things, I was like, I don't think I'm interested in that. And that was like fine in elementary school. But as I got older, I sort of realized that like, oh, other people are doing things. And that took me a while to realize, because I think like I wasn't absorbing that naturally, that it was like, it took me a very long time to realize that like there were expectations for I think it's more of a middle school thing that there were expectations for how you're supposed to act, that like people don't generally wear bonnets. Like it's cute when you're 5.
Honestly, I never really thought about it because it's one of those things where it's like you just take it for granted. I grew up in Maryland, in Central Maryland specifically, which is like a fairly liberal area, I'd say, but it's not like, you know, gonna be on the same level as like California, for example. So yeah, it's just like this sort of thing where you really just like don't question it, and I had the sense that I was different from other kids, but honestly, I think that was just, like my undiagnosed ADHD coming in there. Yeah, I just never really thought about it. I just knew I was different, but I just thought I was weird.
I feel good about it. I never questioned about it, which I think is a good indication that I feel secure in the fact that I am a girl. I think I've been told that I'm not like a normal one, and I think that has always bothered me because I've never felt like I'm not a girl or not a woman. So I've always been comfortable with that. It's just sort of this idea of like when going through puberty, people started wondering why I wasn't really that interested in makeup or dressing certain ways. I guess I had a bit of a tomboyish look when I was younger. And I mean, I dress more femininely now, but even then I'm not like, still not enough for my family or like close family friends.
I've always felt more close to femininity and womanhood as a concept because of the way I'm looked at by the way I do look societally, but I've never felt like I have to be a certain way because I look this way, or that I really have a gender identity at all. It kind of seems like I just don't have one, that I'm myself, and I don't have to explain that to anyone kind of mentality. But at the same time, I'm not uncomfortable being boxed into one or the other depending on what people see me as, because I know that's going to be different for everybody in every culture, and it just doesn't impact me. And that's not everybody's experience, but it's definitely mine.
Do you remember a time in your education where you felt that your assigned gender at birth was influencing how you were being taught?
I know that I received a lot of favoritism, particularly, well, definitely not in elementary school. In elementary school, I didn't care about the teachers. But in middle school, I got all A's except for 1B my first semester. And because of that, I was the bearer of a lot of favoritism, which could have been influenced by the fact that I was seen as a girl, because it's easier to be idealized by others if you're a small, diminutive, quiet girl, because you seem like something that's sweet and something that can be idealized. At one point in 8th grade, a teacher told me that I shouldn't go on to IB history because I couldn't take it, which was weird because I got all A's in his class. But also I was a quiet child, so maybe that was just because, I didn't speak up enough in class and my handwriting was shit. But I didn't understand why he thought I didn't have the mettle to go to IB history. I did go to IB history anyways.
So, when I was a kid in elementary school, I loved reading the Boxcar Children. The Boxcar Children was my jam, okay? Like mysteries, family, great. I loved it. My teacher wanted me to read Junie B. Jones. I don't know why she wanted me to read Junie B. Jones, because, it's not, I don't know. I just think the Boxcar Children is way better, but I might be biased. Anyway, she confiscated my Boxcar Children book and made me read Junie B. Jones. Can you imagine? I hated it.
Yeah, I think it less so in elementary and middle school, although looking back now, I also do think that, the rowdy boys were put next to the quiet girls, and I was, one of the quiet girls, and so, I would often be forced to sit next to the rowdy boys, because the idea was that, like, our, I guess, like, we would sort of they would absorb our, like, I don't know, calmness and not misbehave. And it ended up sort of, I guess it wasn't technically split down gender lines, but that ended up sort of being split down gender lines. But other than that, I actually don't really have a lot of recollections of, in education at least, of gender sort of norms, I guess. In high school, I think that it became more apparent to me that, and in middle school too, it became more apparent to me that, like, there were girls and there were boys, and, like, what those expectations really meant. I think that, like, at least in education, that, like, I think that in school, and I'm trying to figure out how to articulate my thoughts, but I think that in school, in elementary school, I was just sort of, like, in my own little world with my Harry Potter fan club, which is what we called my friends.
So we had a, like, science program at my high school. We weren't a magnet school. Like, to be clear, I went to public school. This was just, like, a program at my school that you could, like, join if you wanted. And it focused a lot on, like, first off, like, programming and computer science, and then stuff like physics and engineering. And so naturally there were a ton of guys there who gravitated towards it, who were like, oh, I'm super smart, look at me, I'm really good at science. And there was so much posturing because they would, like, inflate what they knew. And, like, because they inflated what they knew and acted like they knew everything, if you didn't know everything, then you'd be like, oh god, I don't know everything, therefore I must not be good at, like STEM stuff, right? And so that's actually probably the primary reason why I didn't, like, want to go into STEM earlier. Like, now that I'm in it, I'm like, yeah, I can't see myself doing anything else, just because, like, this to me is the most interesting thing possible. But yeah, just high school boys, man, they were just so obnoxious.
I think in some ways it could have affected the way I was taught, or at least what I was expected to act like in a classroom. Like, I was very meek and mild as a student. Still kind of am. And I think the boys were always a lot bolder, but I think they also had more opportunity to be. It was harder. And I don't know if this is, like, true or if it's just I felt that way, but I felt like there would be more consequences for the girls in the class if we were to, like, speak out more.
So often. It was less so in, say, the way teachers approached me, because while the place I lived in was very conservative, in Texas, a lot of the teachers were very well aware that a student of any gender could be good at something, whatever that thing was. So all of my math and science teachers were extremely interested in me loving math and science, and the fact that I did love math and science. So it didn't matter to them that I was a girl, that I was, doing these things as a girl. I did notice in high school a little more than, say, in middle school, that those gender disparities were there, and I actually noticed more so in the humanities and social sciences that when boys did well, they were seen as, like, incredibly intelligent, mostly because they would regurgitate what the teacher said, and because I had my very liberal mom at home, I would bring up things that they would probably consider blasphemous in class and be like, well, why are we talking about this element when, the U.S. is an imperialistic state? We are not good. And my teachers would throw a fit. And the same thing used to happen in high school until I went to a magnet school for STEM students, which was at a university that is largely liberal. So it totally changed the way I was talked to and interacted with, but it didn't change the way other students would interact with me. I faced more sexism and misogyny in my education from other students than I faced from my teachers themselves.
What was your sex ed experience like?
Honestly, this is probably not an interesting answer, but my sex ed experience was easily forgettable, mostly. I know that we talked about sex ed in 10th grade in health class. I remember staring at a display of different condoms and thinking, I'm not learning much from this class. In 5th grade, we were shown very quickly black and white visions of the male and female anatomy, which basically just look like scribbles because we were allowed to see each slide. There were about 20 slides for approximately 2 seconds. It was just like a bam, 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 okay, now you've seen it. Nobody understood what that was.
I mean, I had a sex ed class. I don't really, it wasn't that informative, to be perfectly honest. I mean, what was I told? Don't have sex. That's what I was told. I grew up in Georgia. You think we had comprehensive sex ed? We didn't. The entirety of the class was don't have sex, kids. Here are some diseases that happen when you have sex, kids. Well, to be perfectly honest, all I really remember is them showing us a pregnancy video. And then, and then we all, after seeing the pregnancy video, we all went to the wall and tried to listen for the guys' reactions, because apparently the guys always screamed, because the classrooms were right next to each other. So we were trying to listen to see if they would scream, and apparently one guy bit down on his wrist, on his fist so hard that it drew blood because he didn't want to scream, and none of the guys screamed. I was very disappointed.
Within those classes also, did you see, did you learn about anatomy?
Yeah, we had diagrams of vaginas and penises, and then we had to point, label them.
But did you actually understand how sex works?
Nope.
So my sex ed experience both in middle and high school was never split down gender lines, which I found interesting compared to what I hear from most people. That I remember in sex ed in middle school, there was this older man who I guess was travels from school to school giving sex ed, and he came to my middle school, and there was only 60 people in my whole middle school class. So they clumped us all into one big room, and they're it's sex ed time. And I remember his description of masturbation, and he was mentioning, which was the reason I recall that was that he was talking about, because it was both sexes in one room, he was talking about male masturbation, and that was the first time I ever recall thinking that oh, boys have different thoughts sexually, and different that part is different. And I didn't really, because also I didn't realize I was gay yet, and I didn't really realize that I could view girls in that way, because I knew I didn't view boys in that way.
So I have a very just distinct memory of sitting in my 8th grade health class. And so it's 8th grade, which is already awkward. My gym teacher was going over a table with the different kinds of contraception, and it was in a dark room, and it was exactly as awkward as you think it is. But I just remember he turned to us and he was I'm supposed to tell you that abstinence is the only way to be 100% sure you aren't going to get pregnant. But honestly, if you just use a condom and birth control, you'll be fine. So that was that was sex ed in 8th grade. They also made us do it in high school, and they did mention, okay, I'm pretty sure, I know they definitely mentioned the LGBTQ community, but they mostly just talked about with quotes around it, gays and lesbians. But they didn't really dive that far into either sexual identity or gender identity.
In high school, I did get some actual sex ed, they explained the STDs, and I appreciated that they went deeper and explained things to us about scenarios in which maybe there's some ambiguity, but explaining what sexual assault is and what it means, and even if someone didn't mean to do it, this is still wrong. If you're at a party and you see something going on, speak up about it, that kind of stuff. But before high school, I went to Catholic school my whole life, and that sex ed was a lot more about abstinence. Well, it was only abstinence. We were made to sign a virginity pledge that we, it wasn't like they made us do it, but they gave all of us one. So like, and they had speakers come over and explain to us, like, the usual, the power of God and Christ in your life, and also in your like sex life in your marriage, and how you should wait for the one you were married to in order to start having sex. So we all got this virginity pledge. I think all of us ended up signing it, saying we wouldn't have sex, we would abstain from it until we were married. I doubt that is the case now, because I know several classmates who have children. So no shame to them. I'm just saying, I think like we maybe were too young to start enforcing that on us.
In 4th grade, we were showed our first video about what it would be like to get our period, which they of course didn't show the boys because, boys can't get periods apparently. Gender equals sex apparently. And people with penises should not know what periods are, ever. Yeehaw. So we saw this video and the boys got to go play dodgeball in the gym. Because apparently they're not supposed to know that they're about to develop. They're too weak for that. So we watched this video and we got this little bag sponsored by Always of little sanitary napkins was the label. They didn't call it a pad, they called it a sanitary napkin. Because the video was from like 1824. And we watched another video in 6th grade, so they gave us a year to forget. And then in 6th grade we watched our own video, which was a little more detailed about what an ovary was. And then we watched the video for the people with penises, which everyone was really scandalized by. And at this point, I'd also only seen a penis once, and this was when I had to bathe my little cousin the year prior. So before that, I was literally not even aware that boys had penises. I thought everybody had a vagina. I thought all human beings had a vagina, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sex, regardless of like... So if this tells you about the failure of the sex ed system and biology as an elementary schooler.
My friends' responses highlighted another reason why it is important to talk about gender and education. Many of them experienced social pressure from their peers in regards to gender. It was their classmates that made them feel the weight of their gender identity. And this hits at the heart of why I made this podcast. We are slowly changing as a society, and it is our job as educators to prepare students for that future. We have to ensure that all students are respected in a classroom, and that respect is carried with them into the real world.